Welcome back to Telltale Books again. Tonight we have a discussion, or today, whenever you're watching this, we're having a discussion. A picture just popped into my mind of somebody laying in bed at 2 a.m. watching our video.
That's how I do all my YouTubing. Yeah, that's how I do all my YouTubing.
Yeah.
On my phone.
Well, I get YouTube right on my TV.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, you have a TV in your room.
Yeah.
Yep.
So anyway, there's been, I watch a lot of BookTube channels, probably 50 different ones I subscribe to, and I tune in whenever I can and watch them. Some of them I follow religiously, others I just watch when the topic sounds good. Mm-hmm. But what I come across constantly, with a couple exceptions, what I come across constantly is people saying, I don't like short stories. This was a short story collection. I just don't like short stories.
No.
And so I DNF'd it.
No.
I'll only read novels. That's like
sorry.
That's like somebody saying they won't read poetry because they only read novels. I mean, the short story is a different form. It has different requirements.
Yes.
It requires a different approach.
My question is, how can you even call yourself a reader if you aren't willing to read anything? Or you already have these preconceived notions of, I don't like blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm willing to at least try and read mystery books. I'm not a huge fan of mystery genre, but I don't nix them out of my life.
Right.
Because I keep wanting to try and find the right one.
Agatha Christie.
I'm willing. I'm ready.
Okay.
Gotta do it. I am gonna read Agatha Christie. I've never read her stuff before. But again, I've not been involved in mysteries very much because I found them predictable, the few that I found.
Yeah. And that probably applies to people's attitudes towards short stories, is they probably have read a couple and they weren't very well done, and that soured them, and so now they just won't read short stories because they don't get the thrill that they've gotten out of these full-length 16-volume series.
Yes.
Short stories are different. You have to approach them differently. You have to take that art form on its own terms and not compare it to novels or multi-volume series.
Yeah.
And the writers that do the short story right, they do such a brilliant job.
How you can get so much and
don't know what you're missing.
Yeah, how you can get so much and complexity and relatability and humanness and world building in such a small span of pages is amazing. Mm-hmm. I myself have only ever written short stories because I'm ADD and I have a really hard time telling stories that are longer and remaining consistent. But I can do short stories, and I'm very happy with my end results. I've had my friends read them, and they are extremely thrilled and love my stories. Mm-hmm. So I know I do it well. But it's one of those things where it's like people just are like, I hate short stories. And I'm like, short stories have a great place for the readers with little time.
Yeah.
If you are a person who's ADD, I love short stories because I am ADD, an extremely busy woman because I have 3 LLCs I gotta juggle because I'm self-employed and still want to be able to read. So short stories are great for my busy lifestyle. They're great for my attention span, and they can still be high literature.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And you don't miss out.
You got to remember, Edgar Allan Poe only wrote one novel. Well, he had a second one that he didn't finish. It's more like an outline form. But The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and I don't think he ever, if I recall correctly, he really didn't finish that one either.
Yeah. H.P. Lovecraft.
His whole reputation is built on these short stories.
Yes.
Lovecraft.
Yeah. All short stories.
Technically he didn't write any novels. At the Mountains of Madness and the Case of
Longer,
Charles Dexter
but it was a
Ward.
serial series, part of a magazine.
But those two stories, they're longer, but they really don't qualify as novels. They're novellas.
I feel like Green Mile too.
That was part of
was serialized.
I think that was originally part of a collection, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was like a series of serialized stories, but you only got snippets of it, and it was compiled later.
Okay.
Kind of thing, but like that's the whole point, though. Is like these things originally too. Like that was the main medium. As a writer, you got known through magazines first. In most cases.
Fiction. Yeah,
and like back in Victorian times and stuff too.
in
Even
Victorian
way
times,
back
a lot
then.
of them. Yeah, Edgar Allan Poe.
You didn't know who anyone was.
He built his reputation through magazines. H.G. Wells, he started out publishing in magazines.
Even Shel
like The
Silverstein.
Strand, and Arthur Conan Doyle built his reputation publishing in magazines.
Yep.
And when science fiction came along, it started out in magazines.
Yep.
H.G. Wells and Jules Verne were being published in novels.
Yeah.
Everybody else wasn't getting published unless they went to the pulp magazines.
Yep.
So Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, A. Van Vogt, Hal Clement, Lester Del Rey, Theodore Sturgeon, Philip K. Dick. These people started out writing short stories.
Because that's all you could print. A magazine had a certain amount of pages they could fill, and financially that was the most accessible thing to the average person, was a magazine over a book.
Well, and every magazine would serialize a novel, but that would be split into 3-4 parts over issues. And you could only buy one novel, and that would cover 3-4 issues. So you're only publishing at most 4 novels a year.
Yeah.
The rest of the magazine was filled up with short stories. So the genre was built on the short story for science fiction and also to a large degree for horror.
Yes.
And in the 1950s, you had authors like Jerome Bixby, Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison's another one. He only wrote a couple of novels. His reputation is mostly based on short stories, novelettes, novellas, shorter works. And he had an incredible reputation built because there are certain stories that people always bring. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Is the one everybody talks about. But you could pick up any one of his collections, read any one of his stories, and it's going to be just as damn good.
I feel that way about Charlotte
Perkins. Brilliant
Perkins.
of a writer.
Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She's known for the yellow wallpaper, but I have this collection of work, and I'm enjoying every single short story she's written here. Some of them are 2 and 3 pages, and they speak volumes so concisely.
Yeah.
Like, why wouldn't you want a straightforward story that's good? Why wouldn't you want that?
Right. And then a lot of the classic science fiction novels, like Foundation, that wasn't a novel. It was short stories that were published in Astounding Stories, Astounding Science Fiction, over a couple of years in the early 1940s. Yeah. And then there was another short story that Asimov wrote specifically for the novel, and he put them all together and published it as Foundation.
Yeah.
And that makes it kind of an odd novel because it isn't a single story with a beginning, middle, and ending. It is these 4 stories.
Yeah. From different perspectives.
Are related through this loose history that's going on.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it a novel. So Asimov had this overarching story in mind that was based on
he had a general outline of the whole picture.
It was based on the fall of the Roman Empire. And so he had that as his model, and he fit these stories into various parts of that history of the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's how he wrote this. But he wrote it as short works, is the point.
Yes.
Another great science fiction novel, City, by Clifford Simmack, is another one where it's a bunch of short stories that have this related world. And in the 1950s, after they had all been published in the science fiction magazines in the 1950s, when publishers were looking for science fiction because of the UFO craze and all the movies coming out, he put them together and published it as City.
There was this really cool book that I read, and I can't even remember. It was various authors, but they had all built this one world with basic outline of universes together. And all these artists wrote different stories with this basic outline of what the world building they all did collaboratively together. And it was so interesting and so awesome. I had found that book at a dollar store. I can't even remember what it's called, but just that people have the capability of even doing something like that. There's so much you can do with the short story, and you don't have to stick to one author even to really enjoy it. It's even collaborative world building. and then writing stories within that is really neat. Like,
And I don't know if this is the book you're referring to, but Harlan Ellison actually came up with a world called Medea. And he invited some of the top writers of the 70s to write
that might have been
stories,
it.
and it all
I
went
think that might
together
have
as
been
a
it.
book.
I think I read that when
It's
I was
called
like,
Medea,
I found
Harlan's
it
World.
at a dollar store, the Dollar Tree, when I was in like, I think it was
You should have kept it.
my sophomore year of college.
I have a copy of that. Hardcover copies of that are going for hundreds of dollars now.
Really?
Yeah, I've got the softcover copy.
This was
that
a really
published
modern.
back
Maybe
then.
it was. Maybe it wasn't that then. I don't know.
Okay.
I can't even remember what it was.
Mhm.
But it was something similar along those lines, and it was
Yeah.
really cool. I really enjoyed it. It was great, but it was one of those things where it's like I couldn't haul everything home with me from campus when I was moved out back home from college.
Oh, no.
And so it's like you had to make sacrifices, and the books usually were the easiest to sacrifice. They really weren't the easiest, but like, I mean, it was a dollar store book, and I was like, even though I really enjoyed it, I can donate it, and maybe someone else will enjoy it too.
Yep.
But yeah, like, I feel like most of my life has been impacted by short stories more so than just novels. Because I had more time for short stories, and I had the attention span for short stories, especially like in college. I was trying to do more pleasure reading my junior year, so I read a lot of novels that year because I just happened to have a shorter amount of credits. But it's because I had to wait till my senior year of college to get the rest of my classes. So I was taking 22 credit hours my senior year.
Wow.
And the only thing I had time to pleasure read were articles and short stories. So I still had my pleasure reading, but I was getting books that were compilations of short stories. Or compilations of a person's short stories. Garth Nix has a great one called Across the Wall.
Okay.
A collection of short stories of his that are really great.
I've got a different collection of his short stories.
Yeah.
Haven't gotten to reading it yet.
Yeah, it's really good. I enjoy his short stories. He has a lot of really cool things. When I was a teenager, there was a collection of short stories. I can't even remember the author. But the book was called Waifs and Strays, and that had some really great fantasy stuff in it that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I just feel like people underappreciate the medium, and a lot of it is because you're just not choosing the right short stories. Like, I love reading the classics.
There are differences. You know, obviously, characterization can't go as deep as like The Shining does. World building has to be cut short. You have to get right to it. Yeah. And that's the thing with the short story. You have to get rid of all the fluff.
You start in the middle of the action, really.
You dive in, you tell the story, you have a point that you're driving towards.
Yeah.
And everything you do, you have to do with an economy of scale and make it all build towards that point.
Yeah.
And along the way, you do have to build character. You do have to build atmosphere. You do have to set the place.
Yep.
You have to do all those things. You just have to do it with an economy.
Yes.
That you don't have to worry about when you're writing a 16-book
how much of this,
series.
how much of this is useful? You have to sit there and evaluate how much of this is useful and how much of it is just getting wordy.
So, no, you can't invent your own language. No, you can't write the entire Silmarillion history behind it. You can't have 50 different characters introduced here and there. You can't do stuff like that with a short story. You have to get right to your point.
Yep.
But if done right, it's powerful like nothing else you've ever read.
Yes, and it really takes a lot of true talent to write something well. Do you have any like collections of work of short stories that you particularly are fond of? Or everything you just mentioned, I'm sure?
I have a lot of short story collections because that's how I got into science fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I started out with novels by H.G. Wells, but I very quickly, and went on to Asimov, Heinlein, Clark. But I very quickly discovered anthologies of short stories.
Yes.
Very quickly discovered the magazines like the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and Analog, which are mostly short stories. And so I really quickly got into it. Some of the best of the earliest ones I read were Souls in Metal by Mike Ashley, which is a collection of great science fiction robot stories. Yeah. With this really cool metallic foil cover.
Nice.
Space Operas by Brian Aldis had a lot of great stories that introduced me. Where Do We Go From Here by Isaac Asimov, which is his idea behind that is he took some of the classic science fiction stories like Who Goes There and Surface Tension and some of the others from the golden age of science fiction all the way up to Larry Niven's Neutron Star, and he did afterwards to each of the stories where he analyzed the science behind it, which was really cool. Another one by Brian Aldis, a 2-volume anthology called Galactic Empires, introduced me to that concept right after I had read Foundation.
Yeah.
So that was cool. The Ballantine Del Rey books about that time started publishing a whole series of the best of different authors.
Yeah.
Best of Stanley Weinbaum, best of Jack
I
Williamson.
love finding best of, especially at thrift
too.
stores. Though I snatch those up like it's nobody's business. I love that.
And then, of course, the king of science fiction anthologies. Well, maybe the prince of science fiction anthologies. The king is probably Adventures in Time and Space by Healy and McComas, which I got you a copy of. And we're going to pull some stories from that and read them.
Short story appreciation.
And talk about them for November. We've got 4 of them picked out. And then another great collection that has one of those stories that we're going to read, The Roads Must Roll. It's in The Pass Through Tomorrow by Robert Heinlein.
Yes. And
that's almost all short stories. There's a couple of short novels in there, but it's mostly short stories.
Yeah.
And the prince of anthologies that I was going to mention is, of course, Dangerous Visions by Harlan Ellison.
Oh, yeah.
The whole concept there was to get authors to send him stories that have been rejected for their content because
I love that idea.
Over the top. They were dealing with,
they were too much.
With forbidden themes. Dangerous Visions is all science fiction and fantasy that were just too risque for the public, for the magazines. I mean, and back then it's kind of funny because back then the science fiction magazines were not mainstream magazines. They had very small circulation. Hardly, compared to the number of people who are into science fiction and fantasy today. Back then science fiction fans numbered like in the thousands. And so that's how many people would be exposed to stories in this, and the magazines were afraid to publish certain stories because they didn't want to risk any kind of censors coming after them. Yeah.
Especially because a lot of them were so small. Yeah.
But being small, they should have been under the radar.
But of course, they didn't. They had hopes, though. They had hopes to be bigger and didn't want controversy on their hands. They still
felt like they were mostly publishing to teenage boys, and they just couldn't cross those lines.
Yeah, which is understandable, especially if you think that's your target audience majority of the time. That's just wise marketing.
But in the 1960s, you had these authors that, like Le Guin, that were more literate and wanted to write more adult science fiction.
Yes.
They because they were writing science fiction fantasy, they couldn't get published in the mainstream magazines. They couldn't get published in the New Yorker. So they turned to the science fiction magazines because those magazines would publish their stories. But they wanted to explore these more adult themes. And they were getting rejected by the science fiction magazines because their stories were a little too risque.
Too much. They were too much.
So Harlan Ellison is one of those authors that was being rejected for such things. A lot of his stories ended up in men's magazines. And so he published Dangerous Visions, and he went on to publish again Dangerous Visions. Again, a follow-up collection with just some absolutely brilliant short stories in all short form.
Yeah.
And some of the number of Hugo and Nebula winning stories that came out of those 2 anthologies is just mind-boggling.
I'm really surprised that people don't enjoy short stories more because I feel like our school system really focuses a lot on short stories or excerpts, concise versions of things or whatever. Because I felt like in high school as a kid, in most of my English classes, a majority of what we read was not full novels.
Mm-hmm.
They were short stories, short poems, I mean, we read, like, the classics, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Scarlet Letter, that kind of stuff, but
there were a lot of great short stories by those authors. Of course, most of Edgar Allan Poe. Rappaccini's daughter by what's his name, that came from Salem? Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yes. I was like, Cotton Mather? No, I don't know why I was thinking that.
Of course, H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
And most of the Sherlock Holmes stories are short stories collected together. There's a few novels in there, too.
Yep, all of H.P. Lovecraft. I think that's the one that I think blew me away the most thus far with short stories. I had not read much of his stuff. I had read, like, some of, like, the very Call of Cthulhu specific sorts of things, and that's only because I had been introduced in college to the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game that a lot of my friends were playing, and then I figured, I should dive into the mythos and kind of get the history behind this, and then I just recently, a few months ago, finished the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft, and those were really great stories, and they all weave together so well, and the monsters are real. I think that's probably one that impressed me the most. I really enjoyed one of the books we reviewed too, Critical Mass, with C. Scott Davis and other short story writers and artists. I really enjoyed that one. What was it? Sarah Reed? I recently read one of her.
you read one of her collections.
Yeah, one of her collections of short stories, and they're all water themed, which was really amazing, and they're all so different. Just really enjoyed her stuff, and she's a local author for us. She lives just over in Appleton. Yeah. So she also works at the Barnes & Nobles worked, I don't know if she still does, but before COVID, she worked at the Barnes & Nobles. I frequent a lot. So, I mean, it was really cool.
And she wrote a novel that won the Bram Stoker Award.
Yeah, she did. She wrote a novel that
first novel.
Yeah, and I have an autograph edition of her book because she was there to autograph it. It was awesome. But I feel like those stories have really impacted me a lot. Of course, Garth Nix is one of my favorite authors, and he has he has two collections now of short stories. I think one is Across the Bridge, or To Hold the Bridge. Yeah. And the other one is Across the Wall. Okay. I enjoyed both of those really, really very much. Of course, Edgar Allan Poe I was obsessed with since middle school. Yeah. Because I was an emo kid, like emo/goth girl.
There are some other great short stories outside the genre. Ernest Hemingway, some of his short stories are incredibly famous. Snows of Kilimanjaro, short story, one of the greatest works of American literature. Have you ever heard of The Most Dangerous Game? Yep. I forget the author of that. It's a short story. It's a brilliant short story. So the short story form is not something that you should just reject. You should explore it. Yes, you're going to read a lot of bad short stories. You're also going to read a lot of bad novels.
Start with the classics. That's what I always recommend. Start with the classics. They're the foundation of how they became what they are. For sure.
And we've got another battery flashing as usual. I hate these batteries. So we need to wrap this up and say, just read short stories. Don't have such a prejudice against the form. It is brilliant.
Yes, it has its place.
With that, we bid goodbye until next time. Have a good read.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.